In the morning, Martha was busy with her usual duties at the clinic. Today, the older nurse, Barbara, was yawning and rubbing her eyes as she finished her night shift. She told her colleague, Martha, "Nothing happened in the ward. Everything's fine. But pay attention to the patient in room 4. She's constantly asking for painkillers." Margaret, a round-faced, cheerful old lady who preferred to be called by her first name, was already waiting for the young nurse at her room's door with another gift in hand. She had been in the clinic for over a week and always tried to treat the kind ward nurse to something. "Martha, here you go. My grandchildren brought me a big bag of apples. I can't eat more than one because my teeth hurt. Take it with you and have it during your lunch break." "Thank you," the nurse replied with a smile, knowing that refusing might upset the patient. "Martha, let's do the patient rounds," called the head of the surgical department from the far end of the corridor. She quickly grabbed her notebook and pen and hurried after him. After the rounds, there would be a lot of paperwork to fill out and all the doctor's orders to carry out. There would be no time to rest, but she still loved her job. When she was at the clinic, she could forget all her problems, like the argument she had with her mother-in-law, Susan, that morning. Susan was a very domineering and tough woman who owned a successful business. She considered herself the rightful owner of the apartment she had given to her son and Martha 3 years ago when they got married. It was at that time that Martha had successfully graduated from medical college, received her long-awaited diploma, and started working in the surgical department at one of the best clinics in the city. Her mother-in-law had always been against this profession, believing that Martha was meant to stay home and have children. "Just look at yourself. Your wide hips are made for having children. I need a grandchild, and the sooner the better." Her successful business, which included a chain of stores, gas stations, and more, was constantly expanding. For some reason, Susan had decided that a grandson, raised properly by her, would eventually inherit it all. Susan had no faith in her own son. She thought he was too weak to manage such a business. Martha didn't appreciate this pragmatic approach, but she loved her husband and endured his mother's remarks, hoping she would eventually stop. Martha couldn't conceive, and Susan forced both of them to undergo thorough medical examinations, but the cause of their childlessness was never determined. The test showed that they were both perfectly healthy. "This happens sometimes," the reproductive specialist explained. "Not everyone conceives right away. We live in a poor environment and we're often stressed. I recommend taking vitamins, following a special diet, and getting plenty of rest and sleep." From then on, Susan constantly meddled in their lives. She bought a huge variety of vitamins and supplements, and even started tracking Martha's menstrual cycle. Martha sighed resignedly. She wasn't opposed to having a child. She genuinely wanted and anticipated it, but she believed it should happen naturally. But Susan didn't stop there. She would arrive at their apartment unannounced at any time of the day to check their fridge and see what they were doing. This is what real stress looks like, Martha thought, observing her mother-in-law's intrusion today. Knowing that Martha had to be at work by 8:00, Susan arrived at 7 and sat at the kitchen table, lips pursed in disapproval, watching Martha get ready for work. "It's your fault you can't get pregnant because of your job," she said. "You're always working, interacting with sick people. It's very harmful." "Susan, why do you say such things?" Martha asked indignantly. "I like my job. It helps me distract from negative thoughts." "Who cares about your negative thoughts?" Susan snapped. "First, give me a grandchild, then do whatever you want." Martha knew it was pointless to argue. She sighed heavily and suggested, "Let's discuss this another time. I'm late for work." "What work are you late for?" her mother-in-law shouted. "Did you even hear what I just said? You need to quit your job today." "Sorry, Susan, I have to go. Someone at work is waiting for me to take over so they can go home and rest," Martha said quickly, rushing out of the apartment, trying not to listen to Susan's outraged shouts. The topic of Martha's resignation was frequently brought up in their home. There was even an instance when Susan arranged for a friend to be admitted to the surgical department and complain about Martha to the department head. The department head quickly saw through the deception. Confident in his best surgical nurse, he ignored the accusations. Martha was outraged by her mother-in-law's behavior, but what could she do? She didn't want to cause constant conflicts. For the past 6 months, Martha often wondered if she was truly happy in her marriage. Even the luxurious 3-bedroom apartment in a new upscale building didn't bring her joy. Everything in the apartment was done according to Susan's preferences, and the few ideas Martha had suggested were criticized and rejected. Her husband remained silent and never got involved in the arguments between his mother and wife. Paul had changed a lot recently. 3 years ago, he was a loving boyfriend with a bouquet of flowers in hand. Now he constantly lay on the couch, watching TV and asking what was for dinner. He had made it so that all of Martha's friends stopped communicating with her and reacted jealously to every call on her mobile phone. Martha could only leave the house for work, where she could forget about her family problems. Therefore, she was always happy to put on her favorite blue medical uniform and start her duties at the clinic. Even the most difficult and demanding patients in the surgical department never argued with her. The young nurse always found time and a smile for everyone. Sometimes care and attention are much more valuable than medical treatment. However, that day something unusual was happening in the clinic. The head nurse was constantly running around the corridor, and the head of the surgical department had a very focused expression. Martha also noticed Karen, a nurse who was not supposed to be working until the next day. "Aren't you supposed to work tomorrow?" Martha asked her. Karen shrugged and turned away. "Martha, come to our office," one of the doctors called her. When Martha entered the office, the head surgical nurse immediately started yelling at her, pointing at something in the records. "Look, there's a missing pack of parental nutrition. Where is it? We've checked everything." Martha was surprised because this expensive accountable medication hadn't been prescribed to anyone for a long time. "I don't know where it is." "Why are you asking me?" she asked. Karen, who had been standing aside and until then had been silent, suddenly spoke up. "I handed that pack of medication to Martha and she signed for it in this logbook." "What? When did this happen?" Martha asked indignantly. "I didn't take that medication." "Martha, it's better if you confess," the head nurse said, looking intently at her subordinate. "Your signature is indeed here." "I didn't see any pack. I didn't take anything." Martha tried to defend herself, tears in her eyes. "Why would I lie to you? This will cause a scandal in the clinic." The head nurse confidently told the department head, who was silently observing the conversation, "I won't be responsible for this. I'm calling the police." "But I'm not guilty, really," Martha cried out to the department head. The man just sighed, shook his head, and left the office. "Why did you do this, Karen?" Martha asked the nurse. Hearing the question, Karen quickly turned and left the office, followed by the other colleagues. Martha sat down on the couch and burst into tears, covering her face with her hands. How could this happen? Was she really going to be accused of something she didn't do? She was terrified and heartbroken, unable to stop crying. After the police arrived at the hospital, for some reason Martha's mother-in-law, Susan, showed up as well. She closed herself in the department head's office with the police officers and discussed something with them for a long time. Then Susan emerged and arrogantly said to her daughter-in-law, "You should be grateful to me. I managed to arrange it with the police so that you won't face any trouble, but you need to write a resignation letter immediately." The department head, standing in the doorway, said sadly, "If you do this, you won't have any problems. It's for the best, believe me. There's a resignation letter and a pen on the table. You just need to sign it." Martha was deeply upset, and even the warm spring weather no longer brought her any joy. She trudged home, her legs feeling heavy, as if weighed down by lead. Usually she would quickly climb to her third-floor apartment, but today she had to take the elevator because she just couldn't manage the stairs. Still in a daze, she unlocked the door and stood on the threshold, unsure of what to do next. The only thought in her mind was what she would do alone in this empty apartment now. Susan would definitely do everything she could to keep her confined here. Martha walked into the quiet hallway. Paul must still be at work, Martha thought. But then she heard a noise and stopped in her tracks. At first, she thought there were burglars in the apartment. Then she heard movements and moans coming from the bedroom. Only after this did she notice the unfamiliar women's shoes in the hallway, high-heeled leather stilettos next to her husband's sneakers, the ones he had worn to work that day. Martha already understood what was happening, but she still refused to believe this unpleasant reality. She quickly walked to the bedroom and quietly opened the door. She just stood there, staring at the bed where Paul had sworn eternal love to her, whispering that no other women existed for him. Now it turned out other women did exist for him, at least one other. There was a long-legged girl in a lacy bra, with long extensions. Next to her lay her naked, smiling, and satisfied husband. Interesting, Martha thought. Does he always entertain himself like this when I leave for work? What she saw in the bedroom disgusted and repulsed her. Noticing his wife, Paul instantly stopped smiling. He quickly got up from the bed and started putting on his pants. "Martha, wait. I can explain everything," he shouted, but she didn't want to hear his stupid, deceitful excuses. Silently, she began packing her clothes into the small suitcase she had brought with her 3 years ago. "Wait, listen to me first," Paul yelled, grabbing her arm. "What do you want to say?" Martha asked, turning to him. "I'm not blind. I understand everything without explanations. Why are you reacting like this?" "Everyone lives like this now," Paul said nervously. Seeing his wife's reaction to his last statement, he added, "Okay, I promise it won't happen again." Martha looked at her husband with tired eyes. To her, he was now a complete stranger. She felt both pain and amusement watching Paul's behavior. What did she feel inside? She realized that her life would never be the same again. "I won't stay in this house for another minute," she said calmly. removing his hand from her arm. She threw the apartment keys on the hallway table and quickly ran out to the landing. She wanted to run, to drive, to fly away from here as far and as fast as possible. Only when sitting at the train station did Martha begin to grasp what was happening around her. People with bags and suitcases of various colors and sizes were bustling past her. This made her dizzy, so she sat on a bench next to a mother with a screaming 3-year-old. What should I do next? Where should I go back to my mom's? Martha wondered. Her mother had recently found new happiness with a man after 6 years of being alone following her father's death, and Martha genuinely wished her well. Her mom would surely be happy to have her back, but Martha would feel out of place in the small 2-room apartment with an older couple in love. Plus, Paul's mother would continue to create problems for her. Paul probably also saw Martha as his property, and what does he do? Entertain himself with a half-naked girl in their bed while Martha works at the clinic. Everyone lives like this, he shouted, as Martha left with her suitcase. No, Martha didn't want to live like this anymore. She wanted to forget her past married life and change everything. When you want to change something in your life, you need to change everything. Martha even stood up from the bench, looking into the distance with a determined gaze. The crying child next to her suddenly fell silent and seriously watched the strange woman. First, she decided to get a new phone number and ruthlessly threw her old SIM card into a trash can. This symbolic gesture gave her a bit of a boost and inspired her next action. With her small suitcase, Martha went to the suburban ticket counters and, without much thought, bought a ticket to a random place with an interesting name that reminded her of a magical fairy tale land. That's exactly the kind of place I want to live. That's where I'll be happy, she thought. Why shouldn't she move there? Martha fondly remembered her childhood summers when her parents would send her to her grandmother's house. After the city hustle and endless streams of people, the small town seemed like a completely different world where everything was calm and measured. It seemed that even time moved differently there. She vividly recalled the fruit orchard next to a cool stream. She remembered how she loved watching the huge, shiny dragonflies and colorful butterflies flying overhead, and the smell of freshly cut grass in the morning. Martha would wake up to the rays of the sun streaming through the small window of the wooden house. A small pitcher of fresh milk and aromatic, freshly baked muffins would already be on the table. By that time, her grandmother would be working in the garden, and Martha, after a quick breakfast, would rush to help her. Working together, they got the job done faster and had more fun doing it. Her grandmother patiently explained how things grew, why they constantly weeded, and why they sprayed the plants to protect them from insects. Young Martha listened intently, absorbing all the information, and spent the summer watching each stage of the garden's growth. For her, it was an extraordinary miracle to plant a seed, water it, and then watch with bated breath as a tender sprout emerged, unfurled its green leaves, and reached upwards, eventually bearing fruit. All it needed was watering, fertilizing, and nothing hindered its growth. In the small town, there were other treats too. On weekends, her grandmother baked a cake for her. She made a huge sponge cake, cut it in half, and filled it with butter and thick, aromatic jam. This simple dessert seemed incredibly delicious, better than any store-bought cake. After finishing 6th grade, Martha didn't return to the village because her grandmother had passed away. She cried for a long time, remembering her grandmother's warm, loving gaze and caring, wrinkled hands. Her parents sold all the farm animals her grandmother had looked after and sold her house to the neighbors for a small sum. But Martha's love and care for nature stayed with her forever. In the suburban train, there were few passengers, so Martha chose a window seat alone. She was anxious and a bit scared, unsure of what to do next. The train doors closed, and she felt it begin to move. Thus, she mentally said goodbye to her past life. Soon, neat little houses surrounded by blooming gardens appeared outside the window, followed by endless fields. The rhythmic sound of the wheels helped her focus and reflect on what had happened in the past day. Now, she realized that her decision had been spontaneous and somewhat foolish. Soon she would step off the train in an unfamiliar place. What should she do next? As the journey continued, she grew increasingly nervous and anxious. At the final stop, she got off the train feeling disoriented. The place she arrived at was not as magical as she had imagined. She saw 3 empty train platforms and a small, freshly painted building. She knew it would get dark in a few hours. Where will I stay? Will I have to spend the night at the station? I need to find out if there's any kind of hotel here. I don't have much money, but I have no other options. Martha noticed an elderly woman struggling with 2 huge bags. Her flushed face suggested she was on the verge of a hypertensive crisis. The kind-hearted Martha couldn't just pass by and offer to help. "Why are you carrying such heavy bags alone? Let me help you." The elderly woman stopped, exhaled loudly, and began to complain in a sad voice. "Oh, dear girl, my son promised to meet me at this station, but he didn't come, and the last bus to our small town has already left. Now I don't know what to do. I'm thinking of going to the road, hoping someone will give me a lift home." "I'll help you," Martha said briefly, grabbing one of the bags. They headed towards the bus stop and struck up a conversation along the way. Cynthia lived in a small town 20 miles away. Yesterday, she received her benefits and decided to go shopping in the city, but unfortunately found herself in a tough situation now, trying to make her way home alone. Martha, choosing not to delve into her personal details, simply mentioned leaving her husband and seeking a life closer to nature. Cynthia tactfully didn't pry further and exclaimed cheerfully, "Come live with us. We have beautiful countryside around with a river, forests, and fertile land. Whatever you plant in the soil here grows effortlessly. But nowadays all the youth are leaving for the capital, so we're left with mostly older folks. It's understandable, as there's hardly any work in our village." Suddenly, a blue old car turned the corner, screeching to a halt right beside them. A man around 40, wearing a leather jacket, jumped out and hurried over to Cynthia. "Mom, forgive me. I had a flat tire on my way to pick you up, so I couldn't make it in time. And as usual, you forgot your phone at home and didn't take it with you." "Harry, my son," exclaimed the woman joyfully. "Oh, thank goodness you found us. I didn't know how I'd get home." Her son quickly loaded the heavy bags into the car's trunk and helped his mother into the front seat. A contented Cynthia glanced out the window and said, "So Martha, what do you say? Are you coming with us? You can stay over at my place tonight, and tomorrow, if you like, you can move to the neighboring house." No one lived there for a long time. The owners passed away a while ago, and they had no heirs. The sun had long set behind the horizon, and darkness was descending outside. Martha didn't hesitate for long and settled into the back seat of the car. They drove for about 30 minutes. The mother and son praised their small town the whole way, trying to convince their unexpected guest to stay. Martha, however, remained silent, peering into the darkness, trying to catch a glimpse of the promised beauty. But there wasn't much to admire. A few dim street lights ahead signaled their arrival at their destination. Under their faint glow, small houses could be seen with lights shining through the windows. The only interruption to the overall silence on the street was the distant ringing bark of a dog. Gary helped his mother carry the bags into the house, kissed her goodbye, and drove off to his own home in the neighboring small town, 10 miles away, where his wife and 2 children awaited him. In the daylight, the small town seemed rather quaint. It was evident that there had once been a vibrant life here. Many houses were made of sturdy brick. There was an asphalted street, and the small town even had a school and a store. But unfortunately, almost everything had been abandoned. The fertile lands surrounding it had been taken over by neighboring farmers, and the locals had to trek several miles to other nearby towns to utilize the fields. Cynthia's neighboring house was small but quite charming. Perhaps an elderly couple had lived there before. There was a spacious open veranda with a cozy rocking chair where one could settle comfortably in the evening with a cup of tea. Martha began cleaning up her new home. It took some effort, but even years of dust, dirt, and cobwebs didn't deter her. She was never afraid of cleaning up, and now it even helped her distract herself from sad thoughts. By evening, Cynthia, her new neighbor, stopped by and praised Martha. "Well done. You've tied it up so nicely. I brought you some food to eat." Quietly and steadily, Martha began adjusting to her new life. Cynthia shared seeds and seedlings with her, and she started working on the plot of land near her house, tending to the garden and gratefully remembering all of her grandmother's advice. Social interactions in the small town were special. The few local residents who passed by her house greeted her and curiously observed her. The young, hard-working girl immediately won everyone over, and soon one incident allowed the locals to start respecting Martha. One day, worried that her neighbor Cynthia hadn't been seen outside for 3 days, Martha went to her house. Suddenly, she saw the woman lying on the bed, struggling to breathe. Her face was flushed red. "Cynthia, what's happened to you?" asked the young neighbor, alarmed. The elderly woman could barely turn her head towards her and mumbled something incoherent, as if something was obstructing her from speaking. Knowing that the woman had long suffered from hypertension, Martha immediately found her blood pressure monitor and measured her pressure. "Good Lord, your blood pressure is sky high," she exclaimed, looking at the 3-digit numbers on the monitor screen, and rushed home to call for emergency help. She ran home because she remembered that she always kept a medical kit in her suitcase. After a brief search, she found a vial of magnesium and a syringe and gave the neighbor an injection before the emergency help arrived. Returning from the hospital, Cynthia, tears in her eyes, thanked her new neighbor. "Martha, if it weren't for you, I would have had a stroke. Thank you for your help. You saved me." As it's known in small towns, local residents find out all the news very quickly. So after that incident, Martha's home became a small medical station. Of course, Martha couldn't cure everyone, but she could provide first aid, give advice, and suggest which doctor to see. The residents of the small town always tried to thank Martha, even though she adamantly refused. She often found homemade eggs or potatoes on her porch. Martha's mom occasionally shared the latest news from the town over the phone. Since Martha moved out of the apartment, Paul had been seen with different girls more often, enjoying parties. Susan was furious with her future daughter-in-law and tried to find her. She had visited Martha's mother twice, But she didn't reveal anything. Martha listened to these updates and realized she didn't care at all. She had a completely different life now with different priorities. She understood that it was time to start preparing for winter, and even if she wouldn't live here anymore, she was sure that this place would help her figure out how to proceed in life. Martha heard a loud scream and went out onto the porch. George, who lived on the other edge of the small town, was running down the street, gasping for air. "Martha," he managed to say, reaching her quickly, "to the river." They found a drowned person there. The girl hurried to the river. On the bank, surrounded by a few men, lay the lifeless body of a young man. He was covered in mud, dressed in untidy clothes with pieces of mud sticking to them. Martha knelt beside him, carefully examined his face, and checked his pulse. Apparently, the man had fallen into the water not long ago. Immediately, she remembered the rules for resuscitating drowning victims. "Quick," she commanded. "Turn him over and lay him on my knee so his head is down." The men instantly reacted and did as the girl instructed. Fluid poured out of the drowning man's mouth, but he remained motionless, showing no signs of life. There was hardly any hope among the crowd that gathered nearby to revive him. Then they laid him on his back, and Martha began CPR. To the surprise of the onlookers, the young man quickly came to, gasping for breath and coughing, spitting out remnants of river water and sand from his lungs. His blue lips turned pink, and there was a meaningful look in his eyes. Blinking, he looked at Martha in amazement. "What extraordinary eyes," he has thought the girl, and said, "We need to get him to the hospital urgently." "No, please, I don't need to go to the hospital," the young man whispered with difficulty, his lips trembling. He weakly grabbed Martha's elbow. "I'm fine. I just need some rest, that's all." Because of the pleading look in his blue eyes, Martha agreed to the young man's request. "Please take me to my home," Martha asked the men standing by the riverbank. Over time, the young man recovered, but he was reticent. The only thing Martha managed to find out was his name, Kenneth. However, when asked where he was from and how he ended up in the water, the girl received no answers. Kenneth replied that he hardly remembered his past. Martha suspected that wasn't entirely true, but didn't want to press him for answers. After all, she was also hiding out in this small town and didn't want to confide in anyone about her reasons for moving. Moreover, Kenneth helped her with everything. As soon as he regained some strength, he immediately asked the neighbors for tools and repaired the porch of Martha's, which had long been creaking and swaying. Then he fixed the shutters on the windows and began helping the elderly in the small town with household chores, for which they thanked him in whatever way they could. He also tried to help his savior in everything he did, all the heavy household work himself. "Kenneth, you don't have to help me," Martha said, feeling embarrassed. "How else can I thank you?" he replied. It seemed that the young man felt not only gratitude towards Martha but also sympathy and admiration. In the evenings, they sat on the porch, drank tea under the light of a table lamp, admired the star-studded sky, and simply listened to the silence. Martha had gotten used to Kenneth always being there, and although the locals had long been gossiping about them, Martha wasn't bothered by these rumors. "He's a good guy, even though he's poor. You did well to start living with him," Cynthia said. "We're not in a relationship," Martha replied indignantly. "I've already told you, he just helps me around the house." "You should take a closer look at him," the neighbor advised. "He's a real man. With someone like him, you'll always be safe." Martha sighed, showing her displeasure, but only because she had long been paying attention to this young man. Although his clothes, even after thorough washing, didn't look much better than before, it was impossible to admit that the guy was homeless. His manner of speaking, articulate speech, good sense of humor, and handsome features with an open gaze had recently been constantly attracting the girl. There was mutual sympathy between them, but neither dared to talk about it and disrupt the communication that had been established between them. Initially, after some time, Martha began to avoid Kenneth more often and tried not to look at him when they met. He would leave the house for the whole day and engage in very hard work to avoid running into his savior. Even their joint evening tea meetings didn't bring them as much joy as before. There were no more carefree conversations between them. Each carefully chose their words to avoid revealing their true feelings. But Kenneth couldn't hold it in, and one evening, breaking the silence, he said, "Martha, I'm leaving tomorrow for good." Martha looked at him in alarm and asked, "You're leaving? Where? Why?" "I don't know. I haven't decided yet," he replied softly. "I understand that you're uncomfortable living with me. Lately, you've become somewhat sad, and I don't want you to be sad. I want everything to be good for you." He gently took her hand in his broad palm and said distinctly, looking into her eyes, "Because I love you. I want you to know that. And also, I will never forget you." Martha trembled upon hearing these words and quickly replied, "I don't want you to leave. I love you too." The unspoken tension between them finally disappeared. There was no point in holding back their feelings anymore, and they embraced each other. These were not passionate lovers' embraces. It was the pleasure of touching each other, inhaling the pleasant scent of skin, and kissing the curl of hair on the temple. It was as if they were studying each other, as if they were made for each other, never to be separated. At dawn, when the relaxed and happy young people lay in bed embracing each other, they watched as the golden rays of the sun slowly and cautiously shone through the window. At that moment, Kenneth finally told Martha his sad story. He had been an orphan since childhood. Despite having living parents, his father stopped living with them when he was 8, paying small child support, and considered his parental duty fulfilled. His mother tried to work 2 jobs, so she sent Kenneth to a boarding school to avoid leaving him alone at home. On Sundays, she would pick him up and promise that soon he would always live with her. The boy patiently waited for the happy moment when he wouldn't have to return to the boarding school on Monday, where there were many restrictions. But at that time, a man appeared in his mother's life, a colleague from her work. They even went to the movies and cafes a few times together. Because of the new relationship with the man, his mother began to look better. But her chosen one didn't want to live in a small apartment with the woman's child from her previous marriage. Therefore, they started taking the boy for weekends much less often than before. The boy silently suffered, feeling unwanted by anyone. And after his mother married this man and they had a son together, Kenneth realized that he no longer had a place in the new happy family. Now he didn't want to have any contact with them. After graduation, he entered college, moved to campus, and had even less contact with his mother. In college, he became fascinated with cars. He loved repairing machinery. When he did this, he imagined himself as a doctor. He accurately diagnosed the illness of the car and always knew how to fix it. His resourcefulness and diligence were noticed, and he was invited to a prestigious car service station. The work was very hard. The managers tried to use the young man's strength to the maximum. But seeing how the work was organized from the inside, the young man quickly realized that he could organize his own business and work for himself. The credit he managed to obtain from the bank was enough only to open a small car workshop and hire 1 employee. Interestingly, some clients from his previous job started servicing their vehicles at his shop. Now, of course, the managers of the prestigious chain of car workshops didn't like this, but they couldn't do anything about it. And the regular clients continued recommending his new workshop to their acquaintances, thereby expanding his customer base. Soon, Kenneth was able to rent better premises, and within 3 years, he opened several car workshops across the city. The influx of new clients became significant. His business became a serious competitor to similar companies. Employees from the car workshops where he used to work started visiting Kenneth. At first, they offered to buy his business, and then they began to threaten him. The young entrepreneur tried to ignore these warnings, but one day he was forcibly put into a large tinted Jeep and driven deep into the woods, surrounded by 4 huge men. Kenneth realized that nothing good would come out of it. In the woods, they forced him to change into some old, torn clothes, and under the threat of a gun, he signed documents transferring control of his business to his competitors. After that, he only remembers a blow to the back of his head and everything around him turning black. Apparently, he was unconscious when they threw him into the river, hoping he would drown. When they found him, they wouldn't bother identifying him because of his poor clothing. Most likely, Kenneth accidentally caught onto a branch so he didn't drift down the river. When he woke up, he saw the kind face of a girl that immediately appealed to him. It was Martha. "You're my savior," the guy whispered and gently embraced the girl. "And you won't try to reclaim your business?" she asked. Kenneth, amazed by such an incredible story, said, "How can I do that?" He smirked. "When they beat me in the woods and left me to die in the river, there were no witnesses. How can I prove it? And if I go back to the city now, they will definitely kill me." "No," the girl shouted, tightly embracing him with both hands. "You don't need to go anywhere. I don't want anything to happen to you." In the small town, all the locals joked about the young couple who no longer hid their feelings. Kenneth and Martha didn't care. They were truly happy, and what others said didn't bother them. Although in reality, all the townspeople were happy for them. The old folks looked at them with smiles on their faces, remembering their youth and the wonderful feelings they experienced when they fell in love. For the whole month, the guy and the girl couldn't get enough of each other, and even parting for a few hours was difficult for them. One day, Martha felt a slight malaise, nausea, and dizziness. But how is that possible? After all those years of trying to conceive with her husband, undergoing medical therapy, and now it turns out the girl got pregnant almost immediately. It's hard to believe. This definitely needs to be checked. Going to town, Kenneth bought several pregnancy tests at the pharmacy and anxiously awaited the results. He paced around the room, unable to calm down. What if it's true? Before Martha, he had several romances, but they all ended very quickly. All the girls only cared about themselves and demanded that he focus solely on them, and he, realizing this, broke up with them without any regret. But now, after meeting this amazing girl, even after their short relationship, Kenneth knew for sure that he was ready to spend the rest of his life with her. Martha quietly entered the room with a smile on her face but a frightened look in her eyes. She silently handed the pregnancy test to the guy, on which 2 lines were clearly visible. Kenneth couldn't contain his joyous emotions and exclaimed loudly, hugging the girl tight, "Martha, "I'm happy to have met you. I'm happy to have met you too," she laughed, tightly embracing him. There was one small formality left. Martha needed to officially divorce her husband. She didn't want to see or hear from her ex-husband at all, but it had to be done. She wanted the child to be born within marriage with Kenneth. Martha decided to arrange the divorce with Paul amicably. She considered herself divorced from him since the moment she saw the girl in their bed. Martha sighed heavily and dialed his number on her mobile phone. But the unexpected call from his wife didn't even faze her husband. He calmly listened and convinced her that he wanted her to be happy and would handle all the formalities himself. He said he would file for divorce and sort out all the paperwork. Paul reassured Martha that she shouldn't worry. She just needed to wait. After this conversation, Martha felt somewhat relieved. Maybe she should have just talked to Paul calmly like this earlier and parted ways, instead of fleeing the city as she did. With Kenneth, they started living together, loving each other, while awaiting the court's decision to formalize their relationship. But a month passed, then two, and nothing changed. Martha called Paul again, who began apologizing for forgetting to file for divorce. He promised that he would take care of it on Monday. Yes, that sounds very much like Paul's behavior, Martha thought, believing him again and again. Several weeks passed, but there was still no result, only new promises from her husband. The young girl's belly was already rounded due to pregnancy and was quite noticeable. In the hospital, the young couple was delighted to hear that they would have twins. It was very joyful news that helped them not to dwell on the worries about the postponed divorce. But Martha grew tired of waiting and decided to start the divorce process herself. She gathered all the necessary documents and filed for divorce. The court hearing was scheduled for a month later, when she would be 7 months pregnant. It probably wouldn't look very nice being visibly pregnant with another man's child at the divorce proceedings. But was it her fault that Paul had postponed filing for divorce for so long and hadn't kept his promises? Nevertheless, she would need to wear something to conceal her condition. On the appointed day, Martha arrived at the courthouse. There she met Paul, who was pacing the corridor with a bored look. It seemed that the man hadn't changed, but there was something strange in his gaze. "Thank goodness you came," exclaimed the expectant mother joyfully. "It means we can get divorced in one court session." Paul looked closely at her figure and smiled silently. When the divorce hearing began, everything seemed to go well. Martha eagerly awaited the end of the court session, not wanting to keep Gary, Cynthia's son, who had agreed to drive her here, and wait. Kenneth had just gotten a lucrative side job today, and his future wife convinced him that the court proceedings would go smoothly without any problems, and she would be back home before dark. She hoped he wouldn't worry and would work calmly, because they would need money soon. But when the judge asked if either spouse had any claims against each other, Paul unexpectedly stood up and loudly declared, "I am categorically against the divorce. As you can see, my wife is pregnant, and it's my child. I want to keep our family together, and we will definitely solve all our problems." Martha was very surprised to hear these words. She certainly didn't expect such a statement. "You're lying," she shouted. "You're not the father of this child," but after her husband's words, her own sounded unconvincing. "The consideration of the lawsuit is postponed. The spouses are given 3 months for reconciliation," announced the judge, banging his gavel on the special stand and leaving the courtroom. Indignant at this decision, the girl suddenly stood up from her chair and unexpectedly staggered and sat back down. Everything around her spun in her eyes, and a sharp pain appeared in her stomach. She clutched it, but the pain didn't subside. "This feels a lot like premature labor," she thought, "just what we needed right now." Several people rushed to her, trying to understand what had happened. They stood helplessly nearby, not knowing how to help her. "Call an ambulance," she whispered, bent over and closing her eyes, moaning plaintively. After some time, the happy young father sat by Martha's bedside in the hospital, tenderly holding her hand. "You scared me," Kenneth said with a tremble in his voice, bringing the young mother's palm to his lips. "My darling, thank you for the boys. They are so wonderful and sweet," he said with a smile, thinking of their sons. "Have you seen them yet?" Martha asked weakly. "Yes, but only from afar," he admitted shyly. "They're so funny, lying there and waving their little hands." "They're greeting you," Martha joked, and then continued unexpectedly seriously. "But they still need a few more weeks. They're still very weak." "It's okay," Kenneth reassured her. "Let them grow stronger. And you need time to recover your health too." He leaned in and kissed her forehead. Martha looked at him guiltily and, tearing up, said, "Paul and I weren't divorced in court. It doesn't matter, we'll figure it out in time. Right now, the most important thing is that there are 4 of us already, and we're together." Martha laughed and looked at Kenneth gratefully. How happy she was now. She had 2 sons and the most wonderful man in the world. The rest didn't matter. Martha eagerly awaited the day of discharge from the hospital. After all, the babies, Jason and Larry, had already strengthened and were lying in her ward in their cribs. She spent whole days admiring their tiny noses barely a step away from her. The young woman anxiously watched the clock. She knew Kenneth would arrive in an hour, and they would all go home together, their big and happy family. how long she had dreamed of this. The young dad mysteriously announced that there would be some surprise waiting for them, and Martha really hoped it would be the long-awaited bathroom setup. In the closet near the kitchen, a nurse peeked into the room and smiled, saying, "Martha, your mom is here. She's demanding that you pack your things faster." "Mom?" Martha asked in surprise. "Yes, she's waiting for you downstairs. She seems to be a very successful businesswoman, by the way. You don't look like her at all," the nurse remarked. Weird, Martha thought. Mom promised to come in the evening after work to the small town to stay with us for a few days. She got out of bed and went downstairs to find out what had happened and why her mom's plans had changed. Hearing a familiar, unpleasant voice from afar, the girl was simply shocked. "Come on, hurry up. Bring my grandsons here. How much longer do I have to wait?" someone was commanding from the corridor. Struggling to contain her emotions, Martha approached the woman who had ruined several years of her life and now, for some reason, had come for her discharge from the hospital. Susan stood in the middle of the corridor, accustomed to commanding everyone around her, in this case attempting to manage the hospital staff. "What are you doing here?" Martha asked calmly, trying not to show her emotions. Martha, Paul's mother, rushed to her, unusually gentle in her tone. "I've come for you and the babies. Look at the convoy waiting for you outside. Hurry, pack your things and let's go. There's a surprise waiting for you at home." Through the window glass before the hospital entrance, black SUVs were parked. "Susan, you're mistaken. These aren't your grandchildren," the young mother tried to explain. "Their father is coming to pick us up from the hospital." At that moment, the smile disappeared from Susan's face, and she said harshly, "Pack your things quickly, take the children, and let's go home. These are my grandchildren. If you go with me now, you'll have a carefree life. But if not, I'll make sure you end up in a psychiatric hospital and lose your parental rights. You know I can do it. Everything will be as I decide. Understand?" Martha, frightened, stepped back from her. She knew Susan could do anything to get what she wanted. At that moment, a bewildered Kenneth entered the hospital, looked around, and quickly headed towards the women. Susan turned to him and fell silent. It seemed she was scared and shocked to see the guy. It was evident that the man was surprised too when he saw her. Everything indicated that they knew each other before this. Kenneth controlled his emotions, hugged the trembling Martha, and asked, looking displeased at Susan, "What's going on here?" "This is Paul's mother. She's threatening me, saying she wants to take our boys," the young mother replied. "This is Paul's mother? Your husband's?" he asked in surprise, looking at the still shocked woman. "Martha, meet the owner of the company that took over my business and tried to kill me." "These are just your words. You won't prove anything. I'll sue you for accusing me," Susan yelled angrily. "I'm calling the police. They'll sort it out. I'm not afraid of you anymore." The young man calmly took out his mobile phone from his pocket and called the police. For several months now, Susan had been under arrest, along with her accomplice Paul, who had also managed to disappear at the last moment in an unknown direction. After Kenneth's statement, a report was quickly found at the police station from an elderly woman, written a few months ago. In it, the elderly woman reported being a witness to an attack on a man in the woods. All her statements and the date fully coincided with Kenneth's words. After lengthy investigations, Susan confessed that it was done to Kenneth at her direction. She also revealed several other companies that had been similarly attacked by her business. She couldn't stop and ruthlessly took over businesses from competitors who couldn't defend themselves. Martha didn't care. During this time, she enjoyed motherhood and family happiness. Kenneth regained control of his business and was constantly busy with it, hardly taking any breaks. His trips to the city took up a lot of time and energy, which upset him. His wife urged him to reconsider his hectic work schedule. "If you want, let's move closer to your work," she suggested. In response, her husband just looked at her reproachfully and remained stubbornly silent. But his expressive gaze spoke volumes. Martha already knew him too well and understood that he had some idea, but she needed to wait a little. Only on weekends could Kenneth sleep well and spend time with his family, so today the kids started making noise early in the morning, banging on toys and shouting. They probably decided to form their own vocal instrumental group. Martha dressed them and took them out to the yard. She decided they'd better shout here, and her husband could get a little more sleep. The joyful boys, immediately medley wobbling on their still unsteady legs, amusingly went out onto the street, and Martha went after them. About an hour later, as they all returned home together, the girl noticed from a distance that something was happening near their house. There was an unfamiliar car parked there, and two men were arguing loudly next to it. She recognized Kenneth in one of them, and the silhouette of the second man also seemed familiar to her. On closer inspection, she realized it was Paul. The girl got nervous, and grabbing the children, ran to the house. But the men started arguing even louder, and she saw Paul pull something out of his pocket and extend his hand towards Kenneth. There was a sharp sound of a gunshot, and Martha saw Kenneth slowly and gracefully fall to the ground while her ex-husband quickly got behind the wheel of the car and drove away, leaving behind a cloud of dust. Martha was very frightened and quickly ran to her husband. "Oh God, help us. I hope he's alive. I hope he's alive," Martha prayed. The girl immediately noticed a large blood stain on the man's thigh and blood on the ground. She fell to her knees in front of her husband and placed her fingers on his neck. Fortunately, there was a faint pulse. Martha took off her blouse and quickly tied Kenneth's leg above the wound, then took her mobile phone and dialed the emergency number. A smile appeared on Kenneth's pale, bloodless face when he saw his wife entering the hospital room. "My beloved wife, come to me quickly," he said gently, taking her hand with his still weak post-operation hand and kissed it. "You're my savior. I owe you my life saving twice. I guess I'll have to spend my whole life paying off this debt to you," he joked. The girl smiled shyly and wiped a tear from her cheek. She had been in the hospital all night and couldn't sleep while the doctors were saving the life of her beloved husband. "And where are Jason and Larry now?" asked the husband. "I left them with Cynthia. I hope she's managing with them," the wife replied, laughing. Kenneth also started laughing, gently squeezing her hand, and suddenly his cheerful expression turned into a completely serious look. "Martha, we haven't discussed this yet," said Kenneth, looking closely at his wife's tense face. "I'm so happy I met you. In my life, everything related to our feelings is very important to me, even the place where we met. What do you say if we all stay living in the small town forever?" The young girl smiled and exclaimed, "Kenneth, I wanted to suggest the same thing to you. It's really fate. I was afraid to tell you about it." Gary, panting, quickly entered the company and shouted from the doorway, "Kenneth, they've arrived from the office." The young director limped out and asked, "Everyone's here?" "No, only the agronomist and the livestock breeders have arrived so far, but they came with their families. Other people are supposed to come tomorrow." "Excellent," said a satisfied Kenneth, smiling. "Everything is going as we planned for over a year now." He had been trying to revive the abandoned little town. To do this, he had to sell all his property in the city and take out a huge loan from the bank to create a farm and open a livestock complex. Finally, everything started working out for him. People began to move to the distant little town where they were promised good working and living conditions. For this, Kenneth had to negotiate with many authorities to establish a medical center, a kindergarten, and a small school here, as well as take on part of the financing himself. Of course, this idea was initially risky, but his wife confidently told Kenneth, "I'm sure you can do it. I believe in your abilities, and I'll always be by your side. Jason and Larry will always be with us too." And so, new families began to appear in the small town. There were jobs and prospects for young professionals here. People tired of the exhausting hustle and bustle of the city moved to a place where there was clean air and picturesque landscapes. Finally, the streets of the small town echoed with children's laughter. Kenneth was happy for every person who decided to move here. He understood their desire to simply live normally and enjoy life. The people who came here were ready to work, to love sincerely, and to rejoice in their growing happy and healthy children. Yes, Kenneth did all this for them, for their future. Let the children see how happy their parents are and strive to be like them, because then they will teach the same to their children. After all, the meaning of human life is in creation. If everyone creates something good and necessary, then the world will become better and kinder.